more than any other day in its history, one Sunday morning in December 1941 changed America forever. For decades before and after, the United States had maintained a tradition of isolationism, staying out of European wars and carving out its own path in the New World. But when Japanese fighters screamed through the skies over Pearl Harbor, they shattered that way of life and dragged America into the conflict raging halfway around the world. But why did Japan attack? And what was the real cost of that infamous surprise attack? This is Pearl Harbor, the day America changed forever. It's hard to overstate the sense of invulnerability felt by most Americans in the years leading up to World War II. Sure, there was the Great Depression, which had lasted for more than a decade and had left millions unemployed and struggling to put food on the table. But that was an economic crisis, not a military one. And besides, the U.S. was already on its way out of that, thanks to the New Deal programs initiated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. America's booming agricultural and industrial sectors were already outpacing their demand. And with the onset of warmer weather, construction projects would soon be underway across the nation, bringing even more people out of the doldrums of the Depression. So when war broke out in Europe between the Axis powers and the Allies, most Americans felt only a mild sense of disquiet. As far as most Americans were concerned, the war in Europe was a world away and had little or nothing to do with them. That attitude was encouraged by the president. FDR had managed to steer the country clear of the conflict, maintaining strict neutrality and pursuing a policy of cash and carry, which allowed warring nations to buy supplies from the United States as long as they paid in cash and transported the goods themselves. It wasn't exactly a rousing endorsement of the American way of life, but it was better than nothing. And it made plenty of money for American merchants. But all of that changed in the Pacific. As the war in Asia escalated, Japan began seizing territories in an attempt to make itself invincible in the region. In doing so, it came into direct conflict with the United States, whose Pacific territories included the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and, most important of all, the Hawaiian Islands. Even before Japan's entry into the war, the U.S. had broken some of its previous policies to defend its interest in the Pacific. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines, for instance, the U.S. immediately sent reinforcements to defend them. On November, just weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, FDR ordered General MacArthur to set up a headquarters in Australia and ordered him to stop Japanese expansion in the Pacific, but FDR still hoped that diplomacy could save the day. So he dispatched his top diplomat, Ambassador Joseph C. Grew, to Tokyo for last-ditch negotiations with the Japanese. But Grew's mission failed, and he returned to the U.S. in early December empty-handed. He confirmed the Japanese emperor's worst fears that the embargo placed on Japanese imports of vital resources like oil and rubber would not be lifted until Japan withdrew its troops from French Indochina, a move Japan had made to secure its empire against any future threats. That meant only one thing. Japan would have to go to war to force the United States to change its mind. All that remained was to choose the time and place. For Japan, the obvious choice was the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. The U.S. Navy had long recognized the strategic value of Hawaii. After all, it was just 2,600 miles from the west coast of the United States. In 1898, Secretary of the Navy John Davis Long declared that whoever controls this island controls the Pacific. At the time, Pearl Harbor was just a small naval station. But by the 1920s, it had become the U.S. Pacific Fleet's primary operating base. 8 battleships, several thousand sailors and Marines called Pearl Harbor home. If Japan could destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, it would have free reign in the Pacific. That was the theory anyway. What Japan's military leaders didn't realize was that much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was already out at sea. The Light Fleet, under the command of Rear Admiral William F. Halsey, was returning to Pearl Harbor from a lengthy tour of duty in the Pacific. While the Heavy Fleet was on maneuvers off the coast of California, the only ships that would be at the harbor were 8 battleships, 4 of them being the newest, largest and most modern dreadnoughts in the U.S. Navy, the USS Arizona, West Virginia, California, and Oklahoma. But even if those 8 battleships were sunk, Japan would still have to face the wrath of the United States. Japan's grand strategy relied on a quick knockout blow, winning a decisive victory in the Pacific before the U.S. could muster a response. Unfortunately for Japan, though, that's exactly what happened. Despite losing 4 of its most modern battleships and thousands of sailors, the U.S. was able to quickly reinforce its Pacific Fleet and launch a devastating counterattack that drove Japan's forces back across the Pacific. In the end, Japan's hopes for swift victory turned into a costly 8-year war that ended with 2 atomic bombs and the complete destruction of the Japanese Empire. It's impossible to say for sure how many lives were lost during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Most of the casualties were aboard the 8 battleships that were docked at the harbor. More than 2,400 sailors and Marines died aboard the Arizona alone. Others killed outright by the explosion or burned to death as the ship slowly disintegrated. Overall, 2,400 Americans died in the attack, including 68 civilians who lived and worked on the island. Hundreds more were wounded. The physical damage to the U.S. was also staggering. 4 battleships were completely destroyed, 3 others were damaged, 2 were docked and undamaged. But even those 2 were forced to get underway and leave the harbor due to the cloud of smoke and fire that filled the air. Altogether, the damage to the U.S. Navy was estimated at between $150 and $200 million. But perhaps the most tragic loss was that of the USS Arizona. Unlike the other battleships present at Pearl Harbor, the Arizona was almost completely destroyed. A massive explosion ripped through her forward magazine, blowing the ship's bow skyward and causing her entire upper deck to collapse. The intense heat ignited nearby oil tanks, creating a fireball that enveloped the ship and lit up the entire harbor. In the end, only 335 men survived the sinking of the Arizona. Their ordeal became a symbol of the Japanese attack and ensured that the Arizona would never be forgotten. And it wasn't just the ships and sailors that suffered damage during the attack. Hawaii itself bore the scars of war. Homes and buildings were destroyed, oil tanks lay in smoldering heaps, and more than 1,000 aircraft were damaged or destroyed. But despite the staggering loss of life and property, the attack on Pearl Harbor galvanized the American public and led to the United States' entry into World War II. Perhaps no one understood the significance of the attack better than President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Speaking before a joint session of Congress the day after the attack, FDR told lawmakers that a date which will live in infamy. He then went on to detail the events of the previous day and explained why the United States had no choice but to declare war on Japan. "There are 2 ways to avoid war," he said. through superior power so that no one will dare to attack us, or by a truly gigantic peace, force upon a defenseless world. Neither policy has worked very well in the past. But since the beginning of this year, our whole system of traditional values has been under attack. By undercutting our overseas possessions, by coercing our allies, and by tightening a noose around the world's production of raw materials. At the same time, Mr. Chairman, our efforts to maintain a reasonable peace have been frustrated by an unreasoning and unrelenting pressure. This has been steadily building up for more than 2 years and more rapidly in the past few months. From these unprovoked and dastardly attacks, our people have been shocked beyond belief. Such a dastardly attack against our country and our people may never again be so unanimous and complete in its horror as it was in the recent attack. In a nation at war, there can be no division. There can be no substitutes for victory. And in a war, there can be no half measures. Our whole system of values is at stake. The very right of the United States to exist is at stake. I ask that you now proceed to the consideration of this most serious and solemn matter. And indeed, the members of Congress wasted no time in declaring war on Japan. The House and Senate met in joint session and voted to declare war on Japan by a vote of 387 to 1. Only one congressman, Charles Dinger, opposed the declaration. The next day, FDR left the White House and headed to his presidential retreat at Hyde Park, New York, where he would spend Christmas with his family. But the president couldn't even enjoy the holiday season with his loved ones. Instead, he spent the day working with his top advisors, planning for the coming conflict with Japan. On December 29, 1941, FDR met with the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff to discuss strategy in the Pacific. The chiefs were pessimistic. They believed that it would take at least 5 years to build up the U.S. Pacific Fleet, enough to mount a serious challenge to Japan. But FDR wouldn't hear of it. If the U.S. waited 5 years, Japan would have the Pacific sewn up tight. No, FDR told his generals, we must strike at Japan as soon as possible. But the president's advisors weren't the only ones skeptical of a quick victory in the Pacific. Many Americans believed that another Pearl Harbor was inevitable, and they had good reason to be concerned. The Japanese had come within a whisker of achieving their goal of crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet. If the attack had occurred just a few days earlier, the entire Pacific Fleet would have been caught at Pearl Harbor, and the war might have turned out very differently. In fact, Japanese Admiral Husband Kimmel admitted in his official report on the attack that if the Japanese had struck just 1 day sooner, practically the entire American fleet would have been wiped out. And it's hard to argue with that logic. The USS Pennsylvania, for instance, was undergoing repairs at the time of the attack and was slated to be back in commission within a week. Had the Japanese struck just a few days earlier, it would have been caught in the harbor and likely sunk along with the rest of the battleships. But perhaps the biggest threat to America's security was the B-29 Superfortress. The first B-29s didn't enter service until late 1944, just in time to play a major role in the Pacific Campaign. Had the U.S. been forced to wage a lengthy war against Japan without the B-29, things could have turned out very differently. But in the end, America's vast industrial capacity proved to be too much for Japan to overcome. Within a year of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. had built up a fleet of nearly 500 combat ships and 168,000 aircraft. By the end of the war, the U.S. would have nearly 9,000 combat ships and more than 400,000 aircraft. In the end, Japan's hopes for a quick knockout blow turned into a costly 8-year war that ended with 2 atomic bombs and the complete destruction of the Japanese Empire. To learn more about the attack on Pearl Harbor, stay tuned for more updates.